Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Iowa City Johnson County Senior Center on our one of our 35th anniversary celebrations. So I always, I put the programs and activities together here at the Senior Center, and I'm never sure how it's going to turn out. And this one was one I was like, oh, please, let's have an audience. So thank you. And I know you didn't come to hear me talk, so I'm just going to make my comments brief, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker today. So, as I said, this is our 35th anniversary of the Senior Center. We opened our doors 35 years ago in September 1981, and some of you might have been recruited to participate in one of our celebration music videos. Celebration was one of the #1 hits in 1981, and so we have forced people into singing along and making a video, and that's going to be debuted later this month, and we're kind of excited to see what our Senior Center Television does with that. So I need to thank our Senior Center Television and our city TV channel for coming in today and helping us promote the event and recording the event for those who are not able to attend. Hopefully they'll be able to see it later. And Emily Light for helping promote the event as well. We have some sponsors today, besides the City of Iowa City that supports the Senior Center in 80% of our funding comes from that. We also have an endowment here in Iowa City that supports the Senior Center. It's called Friends of the Center. So they are helping bring Ashton in from New York today. And then the School of I want to say School of Social Work because I'm looking over at MERS, but it's the Aging Studies Program, School of Social Work, that is also providing some funding for this program today. So after the program, we have cupcakes in the back and coffee, so please don't leave without one of those delicious cupcakes.
And also Q&A.
Yes, and we'll have the question and answer session after. So I'm going to let Ashton go through her presentation. If you have a phone with you, could you check and make sure you put that on some sort of a vibrate or mute or off during the program today so that won't embarrass you when you get that unexpected, my phone never rings, call. So why did we bring Ashton Applewhite to Iowa City? People have been wondering. Ageism. What is ageism? Ageism doesn't exist, or ageism really exists. I've heard the entire spectrum, but one of the goals of the Senior Center is to take a look at what it's like to age. And it's not the person who's parachuting at age 80 and running the marathon at age 90, and it's not the person who needs 24-hour care. It's both those things, and it's everything in between. And one of our projects we did a few years ago was about that, and it's the images of aging. And so we wanted to bring back some of our images of aging. Peter Feldstein put these pictures together. This is just a sample. It's not the full array. But we did this a few years ago, and for our 35th anniversary, we thought we'd bring it back out and kind of show that off. And you can get on YouTube and see some interviews and about a 45-minute, is it on YouTube still, Emily? Okay, just making sure I'm not misleading you. See the interviews we did with the people that kind of talk about what it's like to age and in a reality sense and not what maybe you've been seeing on TV or any of the other media. But we brought Ashton Applewhite in because she wrote this great book that many of you have already read and gotten, This Chair Rocks. And that's not a prerequisite for coming to this program today. So, and you won't get the entire book out of the presentation today. You'll still have to pick it up. And she'll be at Prairie Lights tonight at 7 to do a reading. And if you have the book and you weren't here this morning, you wanted to have her sign it, I'm sure she'd do that as well. But she also has some really interesting things on the internet. She has a blog that she does. Yo, is this ageist? And I looked over that, and I thought it was pretty interesting because I asked that question. I work here for 19 years, and I still say, oh, that sounds a little ageist, or am I just being oversensitive in the way that's presented. So hopefully she'll give you some ideas and some things to think about for yourself, and you can make that decision whether you think something fits that criteria or not. So I'm just going to hand the microphone on over to you, Ashton. Oh, one last thing. She has a mailing list, and she will email you, and she will not sell the mailing list.
And I only get it together to send emails about 4 times a year. So if you want to be on it,
yep, just
or
go
you
ahead
can wait
and
till
sign
you know
up.
what I have to say and then decide. But
And
I'm
we're
going to
pass that
you,
around.
and you can
So.
weigh that big decision.
So let's give her a very Iowa warm welcome.
It is great to be here. Is the mic working? Everyone hear me? No. A little louder. Turn it up. That'd be awesome because I need my voice for Prairie Lights. There we go. I met some of you this morning. You were fantastic. That was not a surprise. Michelle is extraordinary. Emily, I'm assuming, is also, if this is any evidence of her promotional talents, it's fantastic to be here. So I began writing about aging because I was afraid of getting old. And I started out at what I call I'm Not Ray, stage 1, because for 10 years I've worked with this guy named Ray. And if Ray were fatter and wore red, he would be a dead ringer for Santa Claus. And he's proud of being a crank, and he's always complaining about his aches and pains, and he can't wait to retire to Florida. That's true, he's retiring this year. And when I found out that he and I were exactly the same age, I panicked. I thought, what if everyone finds out? They'll think I'm old too. That wasn't just condescending and mean-spirited of me, it was idiotic. But old, to me, meant sad and sick. And I didn't want to think about it till I had to. When it crossed my mind, I flipped the channel. But back in 2007, my ears perked up at a comment from my mother-in-law, Ruth Stein. She and her husband, Bill, are booksellers, and they were in their 80s at the time. And she said, why don't you write about something people ask us all the time? So when are you going to retire? So I liked the idea, and I started a blog called SoWhenAreYouGonnaRetire.com, and I began people over 80 who work. And they were a breeze to find. People were always saying, oh, you should meet the guy who sells ices in the park, or my accountant, or the piano teacher down the stairs. And it was my accountant, actually, who introduced me to Jim Lizio, a janitor with a squeaky voice from cobalt treatment for throat cancer in the 50s. They worked. And he said, I can't sit still. He loved traveling with his second wife. His only beef was that she liked to eat out. And he said, I shop, I cook, what are you worrying about? I met Jemsy DeLapp, choreographer and muse of Agnes DeMille, who says of her life, I danced straight on through. And she blamed her heart medication for the fact that when I try to demonstrate standing on one leg, I begin to slowly drift, so I just grab hold of the nearest strong dancer, girl or boy. Eddie Mae Holmes, who was a shipyard welder during World War II, and then a nurse, and then the proprietor of the Holmes Family Barbershop in Richmond, California. And she told me, don't let anybody push you. If a good-looking fellow comes along and says he wants to take you to dinner, that's okay. But if he doesn't have anything in his pocket, don't go. I met Zola Hellmeyer, who went to work in a rayon factory for 10 cents an hour at age 14 instead of finishing high school. And she works the busiest register at a Walmart in St. Louis because she says, I can't bear standing around gossiping. And it's not the standing that bugs her, even though she's heavy and has had both knees replaced. And lounge pianist Irving Fields, who got hooked on Latin music on a cruise ship to San Juan in his 20s, and whose big hit was called Bagels and Bongos. He was a big deal. And he told me, I play better now than I did 20 years ago. I take more chances. If I used to lie to booking agents about my age, but now that I'm in my 90s, I flaunt it. So this strange thing was happening. The more I learned, and the more people I talked to, the bigger the discrepancy that emerged between what I had simply assumed it would be like to be that old and the reality. So what were some of those assumptions? Well, the grimmest was that I would end my days drooling under a bad Van Gogh print in some ghastly institutional hallway. In fact, the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes. Anyone want to take a guess? 4%, down from 5 in the last decade. Most of us aren't going to end up there. But what about being sick and being helpless? The vast majority of older Americans live independently, and about a third of people 75 and up live alone. Over half of the oldest old, 85 and up, can go about their everyday activities without any personal assistance. People get chronic illnesses, but they learn to live with them. Like Eva Zeisel, who was an industrial designer, and she went nearly blind from macular degeneration at 100. And so she learned to use balsa wood models to design with her hands. I watched her. She had a commission from Bloomingdale's. She was very well established. And I asked her whether it was harder to work like that. She shook her head firmly, and she said, the process, getting shapes out of the air, was always the same. The vast majority of older Americans enjoy independent lives until they come down with whatever kills them. Another preconception, dementia lurks. My memory has never been any good, but maybe I won't notice it if I join the 1 in 8 Americans over 65 who has Alzheimer's. It is a terrifying prospect. But the numbers are growing because more people are living longer, not because the disease is more common. The incidence is actually dropping precipitously, and they don't know why. The numbers, there are more people with it because there are more older people, but the odds of any one person getting Alzheimer's have been radically reduced, which nobody knows. So if you remember the 4% of people over 65 living in nursing homes, 90% of the remainder is cognitively fit. And there's stuff we can do to stay cognitively fit. So, another assumption, that old people don't have sex. Sexual activity does tend to decrease with age, but my 73-year-old friend Robin is having the best sex of her life, and she is not an anomaly. Retirement homes are hotbeds of romance. Almost 1 out of 6 new diagnoses of HIV is in people over 50, and sex is the primary mode of transmission in that population, and HIV is just the tip of the STD iceberg. Thank you, Viagra. So what about another assumption, that old people were depressed because, duh, they were old and they were going to die soon. It turns out that older people enjoy better mental health than the young or middle-aged. And here's the kicker. People are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-shaped happiness curve, and it's been borne out by study after study in the US and around the world. So things started looking so much better that I graduated to I'm Not Ray Stage 2. Trumpet the fact that Ray and I are the same age because look how much younger I look. Embarrassing, but true. Weirdly, counterintuitively, exhilaratingly, the more I learned about old age, the less terror it held. And this turns out to be a true across the board. AARP and the University of Southern California did a study in 2004 that established that, quote, less knowledge about aging is associated with greater anxiety about the aging process. The vast majority of respondents were aware that older Americans can learn, are either working or want to work, and feel healthy, but most of them also thought of most older people as senile, pretty much alike, and having no capacity for sex, so no wonder they're nervous. In this society, we see old age only through the lens of loss, and what people lose is easier to see than what they gain. The losses are real and wrenching. But from the inside, the experience is different. People adjust. Life remains very much worth living, as I think most of the people in this room well know. The illusion that we can ever know what another person is experiencing is called the psychologist's fallacy. And a geriatrician at Johns Hopkins put it in a way that really stuck with me. His mantra was a Mexican saying that the appearance of the bull changes when you enter the ring. Right? The spectator's point of view is different from the matador's. The sight of an old woman hunched over a walker used to make me mutter, put me out of my misery if I get like that. And now I mutter just as fervently, the bull looks different. The bull looks different. A friend's father was completely paralyzed along his left side by a stroke at 76. And he spent the next 17 years of his life in a wheelchair, in a nursing home. And after one routine visit, he told her, "I have to say, this has been about a perfect day." And her last present to him was a Berlitz textbook because he wanted to learn to speak Spanish with one of his doctors. I had to acknowledge and confront my own prejudices. My assumption, for example, that my friend's father would have been better off dead. As the saying goes, there are very few people who want to live to be 100, and most of them are in their late 90s. Here's another handy saying among geriatricians: if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. Right? Compare a group of 14-year-olds to a group of 40-year-olds, or visualize a high school reunion. As the decades pass, of course, we grow more different from one another. So why do we assume that everyone in a retirement home is the same age? That would be old, or that older people are pretty much alike? Because of ageism, discrimination, and stereotyping on the basis of age. It is ageist to assume that all older people are frail or wise, or that kids are like that. Ageism cuts both ways. It is ageist when some clown calls me young lady and expects me to feel complimented. It is ageist and ableist when olders refuse to use wheelchairs or walkers because the stigma is so great, even when the alternative is never leaving home. Ageism is to age what racism is to race. Both are socially constructed ideas that change over time and that serve a social and economic purpose. They are not about how we look. They are about how people in power assign meaning to how we look. Ageism is pervasive and corrosive, and yet an awful lot of people can't even define it. And they have no idea about how we internalize those values and how it plays out in our culture and how it distorts and demeans the course of our lives. Quote, "It's as if nobody has a good old age anymore, let alone a good death," writes age scholar Margaret Gillette. Something in American culture blocks out the joyful and political images, causing people to leap over them to final images of helplessness, decrepitude, pain, abuse, and demeaning death, unquote. Aging is medicalized like a disease and commercialized as an opportunity to sell us anti-aging products to the silver market. And what a market if the right pills and potions can cure it, because everyone's going to come down with it. Slowly, skeptically, gears grinding, my point of view began to shift. I realized that old age was almost certainly going to be different and way better than my grim assumption that it would be a slide into depression, dementia, and puffy white shoes. Although I have to admit, I'm still worried about the shoes. And that was before I had to start seeing a podiatrist. So I changed the name of my blog to Staying Vertical, my exhortation to fend off inertia, mainly when an evening excursion is involved and I'm comfortably horizontal. Stay vertical. But staying vertical is only a metaphor, and a lousy one, because it turns out you don't need to be vertical to age well. Another misconception overturned. Take my in-laws again. That's Bill Stein and Ruth Stein. And Bill's ankle was shattered when the B-17 he was piloting over Belgium was shot down. And Ruth had polio, and now she has post-polio syndrome and scoliosis. So she can't walk more than 3 feet unassisted, but she is the most vertical person I know. So what's Ruth's mode? Denial. Powered by luck and willpower, it has propelled the two of them into their 10th decade like the Energizer bunnies. Which brings me to I'm Not Ray, stage 3. I'm not Ray, and I'm not Ruth. Ray is going to be happy as a clam in Florida. It's the old age he wants. Denial works for Ruth, so far at least, and it is a powerful coping mechanism. I'm working towards the old age I want, and it won't look like theirs. If I can't stay vertical, well, this chair rocks, the name I finally settled on for the whole project. I am not saying that getting older is easy. We are all worried about some aspect of it, whether getting sick, ending up alone, or running out of money, and those fears are legitimate and real. But it never dawns on most of us that the experience of reaching old age, or middle age or even just aging past youth can be better or worse depending on the culture in which it takes place. And this one is really youth-centric. Here's an example based on yet another misconception. When I started thinking about all this, it seemed obvious that fear of aging was rooted in fear of dying. And that fear is human. It's universal, right? Every society, every individual struggles with it. But fear of aging is cultural. Many societies venerate their older members. If the proverbial boat is sinking, they will save the mother, not the baby, because their culture teaches that you can have another baby and that the past has value. And the point is not that one ethic is better than another, but that they are culturally shaped. America's relentlessly youth-centric cultural drumbeat drowns out all but the negative about life after 65. Or 50, when men dump their wives for fertile trophy versions. Or 40, when workplace discrimination starts to kick in, if not younger. Or 30, when women freak out about being over the hill. My daughter-in-law has a friend who's in her early 30s. She doesn't have a partner. She's a model. And she is terrified at 30 about the next 60 years of her life, which is crazy. Unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being, it becomes part of our identity. That is internalized ageism. The more clearly we see these social forces at work, on the other hand, the easier it is to envision alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. Dementia is often the elephant in the room. Physical mobility is relative, but if you lose your marbles, you're screwed. Alzheimer's is an evil disease. The odds increase with age. We don't understand how it works, and we're nowhere near a cure. But we do know that some people with whose brains are full of the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's stay sharp as tacks. And neuroscientists think it's because they built what they call cognitive reserve, which is extra neurons and connections between them. And we build it by exercising, by maintaining social networks, and by challenging our brains, like the wonderful posters here, stay curious, stay active, keep active, and you will maintain brain function. We also know that attitudes towards aging have an actual measurable effect on how our brains and bodies function at the cellular level. People with more positive feelings towards aging, they walk faster, they do better on memory tests, they are much more likely to recover fully from severe disability, and they live longer. Now, not just a little bit longer, an average of 7.5 years longer. There are no guarantees. My godmother, Anne, that's her at the bottom right with me, had an insatiably curious mind, and now at 95, memory loss has her on about a 3-minute loop, and it's getting shorter all the time. And it is wretched for the people caring for her. But she knows me, and the characteristics I love best, humor, imagination, courage, are still there, along with the imperiousness and self-indulgence that have always made her a pain in the ass. I am still available to her, and she to me. Here's the thing. Most forgetfulness is not Alzheimer's, or even necessarily a sign of cognitive impairment. And here's where ageism comes in. Any prophecy about debility, whether or not it comes true, dampens our aspiration and damages our sense of self, especially when it comes to brain power. I used to think it was kind of cute to make senior moment quips until it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. Right? We think that only old people forget stuff. That's not the way it works. As for mobility, it's all relative. Bill and Ruth can barely walk, but they have arranged their kitchen and their living room and their lives so they don't need to. I hurt all the time. I was looking at the list of gym programs here thinking, oh, that'd be good for me. I should do that one too, yeah. What my grandmother called stiffness, my orthopedist calls stenosis, my acupuncturist calls chi stagnation, and my GP says is arthritis. I talk about it to my physical therapist, and I don't talk about it much to anyone else because it's boring, and I don't want to give it more bandwidth. I have to remind myself that pain is just pain, and that not all of it is age-related. The objective is to keep doing the things I want to do. So far, so good. Although the goalposts are shifting. People talk to me all the time, they're terrified of not being able to do the things they always did. And I point out to them that they already can't do the things the way they used to do. It's not like they're frozen in time. It's a continuum, right? My example being bicycling. I still bicycle a lot in New York City, but I used to whiz along in the fast lane, and not anymore, boy. I still barrel along the sidewalk, but not long ago I had to slow down for a 74-year-old friend who was visiting, whose knees were killing her, arthritis. And she marveled that it had happened to her, and I will marvel when it happens to me. I'll buy a cane just like she did and get there just a little more slowly. 10 years ago, when I moved to a Brooklyn neighborhood with a median age of about 23, I said that it would be time to move when I could no longer hustle up the subway steps as fast as the kids. That was during I'm Not Ray stage 2. Look how great I'm doing. Now I let the hipsters pass, or I ask them to help me with my bags. And it's good for both of us. So how about sex? When I was in my 20s, I knew that I was having the best sex ever, and that older people weren't having sex at all. Silly me. Those fast and frequent fumblings are not the memories I cling to. That said, stuff does fall apart. It was a bad day when I was diagnosed with periodontal disease and vaginal thinning in the same morning. Floss and the yellow Listerine that tastes like kerosene are doing the trick above the waist, and my gynecologist prescribed an S-ring, a silicone ring that releases a low dose of estrogen, and it works too. Although my friend with the bad knees told me you can't use it if you've had cancer, which she has. She has had a fantastic sex life, but now lusts more for tenderness. As she put it, you can be intimate with someone in so many different ways. Some men are glad not to be led around by their libidos anymore, and it can feel great to let the whole thing go, to put that energy elsewhere, if that's your choice. But it's easy for older women to feel that the choice isn't up to them, especially straight women confronting a dearth of available men over 55, most of whose sights are firmly set on the premenopausal anyhow. A few years ago, an adorable young guy came up to me at a dance club and told me I looked like Susan Sarandon. And then instantly, his face clouded over. He looked completely stricken, and he said, I meant it as a compliment. He wasn't saying that I looked like Susan Sarandon. He was saying, you look old and you look hot. A message so apparently contradictory in this society that being compared to a beautiful, bodacious movie star like Susan Sarandon risks coming across as an insult. American girls are sexualized at 8 and ushered over the hill 2 decades later. You don't hear look less slutty or look less Asian, but look less old messages are everywhere. Especially for women. We become invisible sooner and more cruelly. This is bigotry. When we accept the message that older equals ugly, and we freeze our faces with a scalpel or a knife, or dye our hair to cover the gray, or lie about our age, we reinforce it. It is a really successful strategy, and I completely understand why so many of us do these things. But it is like a gay person attempting to pass for straight, or a person of color passing for white. It's not good for us. And it gives a pass to the underlying discrimination that makes these behaviors necessary. Someone told me once I should bring a straw to my talk, so sorry, you'll just have to bear with my gulping. Aging means living, so think twice about what anti-aging products promise. Botox, Photoshop, spandex, they are not our friends. Compare today's fashions to what they wore in colonial America when it was actually exalted to be old. It was an honored state. Imagine that, right? Not shunned. And partly because relatively few people actually achieved old age, and old men held the reins. And think about what they wore. White wigs, and stiff frock coats, and stockings that expose the lower leg, fashions that flatter the older body. The point, again, is that fashion represents values that are socially constructed. We can change them. You and I can choose where we find beauty, and we needn't stop at 22. When MAC Cosmetics launched a line of lipsticks inspired by 90-year-old at the time, Iris Apfel, that's her with the big specs, she wears these trademarked, like really dark red and scarlet lipsticks, and they sold out within a week. And I wrote a blog post about it, and my friend Kelly wrote back that it reminded her of a book she owns called How Not to Look Old. It's full of tips like wear soft pink shimmery lipstick so it doesn't draw attention to your wrinkled mouth. And it's true, it really works, Kelly said. And that got me wondering, at what point will I stop caring about not looking my age and just wear what I like? Unquote. Maybe never. Maybe that would signal defeat, maybe victory, right? This stuff is complicated. The book is right about the lipstick, damn it. Sometimes I reach for a gentler color and sometimes I reach for the red. Getting older has made me a lot more forgiving of my physical shortcomings, and that is really welcome. My butt and thighs used to be the source of endless misery, and now that I'm in my 60s, I look down in the shower and go, not bad. I never thought I'd be going strong so long after my sell-by date, and I'm hoping for a lot more company. I feel the same way about the rest of my social life, for which a lot of credit goes to my partner, culture scout par excellence. But except for simulcasts of the Metropolitan Opera, we are often the oldest people in the room, and often by decades. We don't like it, but we like new music and weird theater, and we don't want to stay home just because we'll stick out. I think of it as affirmative action, and God knows that is necessary in this age-segregated society. We need to occupy the space. One year at a big outdoor electronic music festival, people were actually taking pictures of Bob and me. He's 70, I'm 64. And it was kind of creepy, but it was also really well-intentioned. And we made two good friends who were in their late 20s. Real friends. We're real friends, said a woman who came up to me the very first time I gave this talk, and she was referring to a guy in his 20s who was a friend of her son's. And they were fans of an English rock band named Muse that I've never heard of. But this woman had missed out on a wild rock and roll youth, and in her 50s, she discovered rock and roll, and she had become an avid concert goer. And she goes to all sorts of stuff, often alone, and she's brave, and she's having a blast. And in a less ageist culture, what she's doing wouldn't call for courage. So not to turn this groupie into Rosa Parks, but that is how desegregation happens. People with the most at stake, olders in this case, step up and step out. We stop conforming. The open-minded welcome us, and that is how incremental social change takes place. Sometimes being with younger friends makes me feel younger, and sometimes it makes me feel ancient. I know they're thinking, I hope I age as well as Ashton, and I hope that never happens to me. Both are true. And while I hope I'll be able to wipe my own butt to the end, I'm going to need help shoveling and schlepping, and I want to be able to cast a wide net. My worst nightmare is not being able to read, so I was soothed by a story of a woman who lost her vision to macular degeneration when she was 71. And she grieved hard and long, and then she had a book giveaway party. And she was surprised when 3 different friends offered to come read to her every week. And she keeps 3 books going, and she loves those sessions. And just as importantly, so do her readers. The terms and power dynamics are going to shift. The goal is to give and receive with grace. The key, it seems to me, is to embrace the idea that dependence is no more shameful at the end of life than it was at the beginning. No one is truly independent. We are social creatures. All of life is interdependence. And we're all going to need help at the very end, although not nearly as much as all the horror stories about living too long would have us believe. What live too long really means is cost too much, despite the fact that according to the nonprofit Alliance for Aging Research, only about 3% of the 4,800 Americans over 65 who die every day incur very high costs. 3%. And it would be lower if American medicine wasn't geared toward keeping people alive at any cost and lousy at helping us die well. What's the greatest worry for most people? Becoming a burden, How many times have we all heard that? To our community, to our doctors, to our families. It has become commonplace to hear even healthy, middle-aged people wondering whether the ethical alternative will be to commit suicide. That is internalized ageism of the deadliest sort, that just because you reach a certain age, you shouldn't be on the planet anymore. It is the logical outcome of a political system that is increasingly hostile to paying for the health and well-being of its most vulnerable citizens. I've made out a living will and a healthcare proxy and talked them over with my family and my doctor, and that conversation is crucial, because if we're too squeamish to talk about our end-of-life priorities, how can we expect more of the medical establishment? And it also needs to be an ongoing conversation. I talked to someone this morning who said she makes an annual date with her kids to talk about that stuff because the bullock's different. My partner's healthcare proxy is his son because he thinks I'll pull the plug the minute he stops being entertaining. He's right to worry. Mine is my sister because it'll be easier for her to pull the plug, and I think that's what I'll want when the time comes. But who knows? The bullock's different. Older bodies benefit just as much from aggressive medical treatment, like CPR, organ transplants, chemotherapy, and dialysis, as much as younger bodies. Older people have the right to want to stay alive and to the same choices as anyone else. The criteria for medical procedures, to quote bioethicist Felicia Ackerman, should be, quote, the desire to stay alive, medical need, and a reasonable chance that the procedure will work. That's it. I used to be flipped out by the dying part of getting older, but that's looking better too. It turns out that the old don't worry about dying. It was true of the ones I interviewed. I heard it anecdotally from geriatricians, and eventually I encountered it as a study, so it must be true. The older you are, the less afraid of dying. But I didn't really believe it until I learned why. And it turns out that awareness that time is short does not fill people with dread. That was just another assumption that I made. So what happens is that as we get older, we spend our time more wisely. For example, young people will go to cocktail parties because they might meet someone who'll come in handy down the line, whereas nobody really likes cocktail parties. And older people might be more likely to take a pass and to spend the time with a smaller group of people who matter more to them. Children live in the moment because they aren't equipped to do anything else. Olders do it because they know that time is running out. And living in the moment is what makes us happy. It's why the very young and very old enjoy life the most. And if more of us in the middle could master it, we'd be better off. That's one of the reasons I've become an old person in training, a phrase I appropriated from geriatrician Joanne Lynn. I know I'm not young, I don't see myself as old, and I know a lot of people feel the same way. Hang on, sorry, is that? No, we're good. What happens if I do that? That's blank. Sorry, my screw up. We spend a lot of energy sustaining the illusion that old people are somehow not us, right? We aspire to grow old, and yet we dread the prospect. And when you become an old person in training, it bridges that us-them divide, and it loosens the grip of the exhausting illusion that somehow it's not waiting for us. So becoming an old person in training means ditching preconceptions and looking at and listening to the older people around us with an open mind and re-envisioning our place among them. It doesn't come naturally because as a species, we are engineered, bioengineered to live in the present. So that's why becoming an old person in training takes imagination. Here's an exercise I heard from a cheesy motivational speaker. Visualize your 90-year-old self, and some of you may be 90. Where you are, what you're doing, what you're wearing and feeling like, and imagine your present-day self walking in the door. And what would the younger you say to the older one? Would she scold you for being so short-sighted or thank you for the choices you've made? And Cornell gerontologist Carl Pillemer asked over 1,000 older Americans exactly that. What practical advice did they have for living well? And he, expected them to say, what had they done differently? They shouldn't have bought swampland, they should have finished college, whatever. And over people said, I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying. Life is short, they said. Take risks, Say it now. Travel more, worry less. I don't know what it's going to be like to be 90, but I am a lot less apprehensive about it than I used to be. I see the 90-year-old as me, as withered and teetery, but also as curious and content. And envisioning her won't make it happen, but I sure can't get there without the aspiration. Being an old person in training is also a tactical challenge, because preparing for longer lives means working longer and saving more and exercising, getting off our butts, and making friends of all ages and hanging on to them. A dash of demography for younger people who might think this might not apply to you. Thanks to clean water and antibiotics largely, the American lifespan has increased by 30 years in 1 century. A lot of that is we've outsourced death from the young to the old. More people are surviving to adulthood, is responsible for most of that leap. But we have gained an average of 10 healthy years in whatever stage of life I'm in. We don't have a name for yet because it's so new. That's another thing to remember. This stuff is new. Lifespans of the least educated Americans are actually contracting. The outlook for people of color and poor people is a lot less rosy. Growing economic inequality, the premature deaths of the less fortunate, is slowing this fundamental measure of human progress. But for those of us with access to health care and education, for the first time in human history, 4 living generations will become commonplace. I wonder how many of you have great-grandchildren. My grandchildren have great-grandparents. We're going to have more time to figure out what we want to do with our lives, more time to accomplish it and share what we know, and more time to wind down with the people we love. To exploit this extraordinary achievement, we need to overturn the grotesque notion that 2/3 of our years are lived in decline, like my daughter-in-law's friend, right? That's crazy. A guy in my last audience said, I've noticed that it's people in my age group, and he defined that as 25 to 40, who are the most reluctant to say how old they are. In London, I bought a birthday card that said, like most women my age, I am 28 years old. A friend recalled turning 25 and being told, that's your last good birthday. Really? I turned 60 in the Grand Canyon, and it did not suck. Anyone in the room have any fun over age 30? The point is, there is no line in the sand, no crossover between young and old, after which it's all downhill. And this imaginary threshold segregates us, and it fills us with needless dread. So I'm going to get political. We need to reject the zero-sum reasoning that pits the old against the young. There is no evidence that young people want to throw granny to the wolves. And as for greedy geezers, more resources have always flowed from older people down to younger generations. This us or them logic always pops up around healthcare rationing. Why should we spend money on old people who are going to die soon? They don't say that part aloud, when we could spend it on kids. Why is it acceptable to weigh the needs of the very young against the very old? Making the same case on the basis of race or sex would be unthinkable, and it is equally unacceptable to do it on the basis of age. We also need to question alarmist demography that depicts longevity as something we can't afford. We can if we want to. We live in anxious times, and in times of general hardship, one group is demonized for being dependent, say old people, but not another, say bankers. Much of the hand-wringing centers around something they call the old age dependency ratio, which is the number of people over 65 on one side of the bar and the number of people under 65 defined as working age under it. And that number over 65 is growing, and the other number is shrinking. So fiscal crisis, social collapse, Medicare down the tubes. That ratio has been falling steadily for over 100 years, and nobody noticed. Over the same period, national GDPs, along with lifespans, have steadily increased. Do we really think there's not enough to go around for senior centers and schools, for Head Start and Medicare? But resources are not inherently scarce. Budgets never seem to be an issue when it comes to domestic security and surveillance or to waging war. The U.S. spends as much on its military, almost as much as all the other countries of the world combined. This scarcity is the result of policy decisions in a society that demeans and disregards its oldest citizens. So when you hear that 2/3 of life is decline, or that it's old versus young, or that we can't afford longevity, don't buy it. 2 characteristics of marginalized populations: self-loathing and passivity. What my daughter tactfully dubbed the, quote, yuck/pity factor that the prospect of growing old invokes in so many. Shame can damage self-esteem and quality of life as much as externally imposed stigma. Becoming an old person in training is also a political act because it derails this shame and self-loathing. It undoes the otherness that powers ageism and racism and nationalism. It makes room for empathy and action. In the 20th century, the civil rights and women's movements woke us up to entrenched systems of sexism and racism around us. And look how far the gay rights movement has come, right? Just in 20 years. And yet, ageism has barely bleeped onto our radar. Who even blinks when older people are described as confused or pathetic or even repulsive? It is high time to mobilize against discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. When do we stop valuing people and why? Not because we grow old, but because we do so in an ageist world. What kind of world do we want our children and our grandchildren, who may well live to be 100, to inherit? It is time for a radical aging movement. So if you want to do something, the next time you're at a social event, go talk to the oldest or youngest person in the room. The next time you whisper, put a pillow over my head if I get like that, remember, the bowl looks different. And the next time you wonder whether an outing or an outfit or an attitude is age appropriate, reconsider the question. And come on in, the water's fine. Thank you.
And open this up for questions, but I want to keep in mind that there are a lot of people here, so I'm going to have to ask you if you have a question. We'll limit it to 1 per person, so we're not here till midnight tonight. Does anyone have?
We have just one mic.
We can get another mic so we can duel this here. So we'll start right here.
See how many miles you can put on your shelf.
Yeah.
In this gathering, I've only seen 2. There may be just a handful of people who, in age, are south of 40 or even 30. So how do we get the message out to a broader spectrum of the population? Is it by action? Do we start getting on a soapbox about it? How do we propagate this to the entire spectrum of ages?
I think in a very literal way, we do it by hanging out with people who are 30 and 40, because simply by having friends and contact with all people, you know, integration shatters stereotypes. So when we have meaningful relationships with people who are also much older than us, then that person's attitudes about what people who are different in age are like are shattered. I've never made a movement before. I bet a lot of you have experience with the civil rights movement, with the women's movement, and harken back to what changed your mind, what actions, you know, editorials, chaining your self-defenses. I wrote this book. It's a really good tool. I do urge you to read it and to ask other people to read it. I self-published, so my motto is self-publish together. To change the world, you know, put it out there and ask people to ask their bookstores and libraries to stock it, because someone else said it's a good read, it isn't me. But that's a tool. It's a really good tool, and the last chapter has a bunch of calls to action, things we can do, changing the way we speak, and then also changes we might like to see on a larger social scale. Another thing we can do is to start a consciousness-raising group around age bias, ideally of all ages, again. And on my website, which is thischairrocks.com, there's a button for resources, and there's a free downloadable booklet on how to, it's called Who Me, Ageist, and it's about, and I have cards too. And that gives you some tips on how to do it, because once you get together and compare notes, the reason that's such a powerful tool is that when we come together, we realize, as it is now, we think, oh, if I can't open this jar, you know, I'm not strong enough. If I'm worried that I can't get down the railings at the theater, I better stay home. Well, you know, we should be pissed off that the jar isn't designed so that it's easier to open. And why aren't there railings at the damn theater? Right? The problem is not these natural transitions of aging. Those aren't personal problems. Those obstacles are the result of discrimination. So to come together, to share notes, and to understand that they are a function of discrimination that we need to mobilize against. Long answer.
Coming to you.
Well, that's okay. I can talk about it.
Okay, good.
I have a tip for you on opening jars. Next time you go to your doctor and they want to take blood and they use that strap to tie you off,
Right?
they throw that strap away when they're done with it. Take it with you. It's a perfect jar
There
opener.
you go. And also, you know, ask for help. I mean, that's a totally, it's, you know, everything in this field has two sides to it. You know, I happen to live in Brooklyn, a little house on the sidewalk. I broke my wrist in January, and I couldn't get the pain pill open. Seriously, I went like out my front door in my pajamas and waited for a passerby. Was like, open this for me now. But that, you know, we are so imbued with messages that it is shameful to ask for help. And it's really, really important to understand that everyone, each of us needs help all the damn time. And that when someone helps us, I mean, I'm traveling, I'm getting on the subway, I ask someone to carry my suitcase down the stairs. It's like, I could still schlep it, but you know, what am I trying to prove? And the guy is like Sir Galahad. He's like, yeah, you know, and he feels fantastic that he's able to help me. So it's really much more of a win than we think.
Do we have any more questions? Right over here.
Does Ray like the book?
Ray is retiring. He has not heard this talk, but I have promised him one as a retirement present. So, you know, it's all true. And, you know, it took me a long time. I mean, it was, you know, it was horrible the way I was thinking about Ray. And I would be, not horrible, but, you know, stupid and clueless and mean-spirited. And I would never tell the story if I hope it's pretty obvious that the joke's on me, you know, and that was, you know, that's what and it took me, I mean, like 8 years to figure it out, you know, that the way Ray is getting old is fantastic. It's fine for Ray, you know, it's different for me. We're all going to do it in our own way. And that's my beef with all these really annoying, you know, videos that show the 80-year-olds jumping out of airplanes and doing the limbo. I think most of my friends have stopped sending them to me by now. More power to them. But just because you can't do that or don't want to do that does not mean you are not aging successfully. If you woke up in the morning, you're succeeding.
See if I can pass this back to you.
This is not a question, it's a statement. I believe if everybody in this room that believes this, that really thinks this is true, went out and said this to one person today or tomorrow, I like being the age I am, except for the aches and pains. Other than that, I like it. I like it more than fighting through teenage troubles and all the other things. So that's what I think. If we tell people that, maybe they would believe it.
Any other comments? Questions? Well, I believe that Ashton will be sticking around and joining us for coffee, cupcakes in the back. So please feel free to help yourself, and thank you very, very much for attending, and thank you so much.
Thank you.